Marccus Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland. He is also the director of the SIRJ Lab and an affiliated research faculty in the Clark School of Engineering Center for Disaster Resilience. Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abram. And I first, I want to sort of take a moment to sort of give you flowers verbally for two reasons. One, for the wonderful introduction, and for two, for being a trailblazer for folks that look like you and I, to be in this position and to be doing the work that you've done and that I'm starting to do. And I don't take that lightly, and I sincerely appreciate it and want to take the moment to say that. As Dr. Abrams said, my name is Dr. Marccus Hendricks. I'm currently an assistant professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland. I also direct a lab by the name of the Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab. I also want to thank AEESP for allowing me to share this space with you all today as a planner and a social scientist by training, and to be able to share my thoughts and research. Next slide, please. And so this is probably the last group that I have to convince that we're in the middle of an infrastructure crisis, from collapsing bridges in California to overflowing storm drains in Houston. Infrastructure systems are far past their prime, and decaying infrastructure is all around us, including public hospitals, where we've seen, have serviced, marginalized communities and disproportionately have suffered relative to white groups and other groups that have had better service and treatment. The American Society of Civil Engineers has consistently sort of scored our nation's infrastructure from the local level up at a D+. And this infrastructure crisis has been well documented, both in media and a start in the research. Next slide, please. In fact, this summer, I took a moment to further document this infrastructure crisis and to make a connection between the current coronavirus pandemic and our infrastructure crisis by discussing sanitary sewer overflows and backups in the city of Baltimore and a potential risk of COVID transmission by way of wastewater exposure. Next slide, please. However, for anybody that studies any type of disaster or crisis, we know that social stratification is inherent. However, no attention has been paid to where and on whom the burdens of this decaying infrastructure, or this infrastructure crisis, fall heaviest. Next slide, please. And so I want to turn us to sort of a series of social phenomena and events that have transpired since, as Dr. Abrams said, from 1619 and beyond, in terms of the Black American experience, from slavery to Jim Crow, through segregation and redlining, through the civil rights era, to even, subprime mortgage loans, and how Black and brown households were disproportionately affected in 2008 during the Great Recession. Next slide, please. These social processes, from poverty to discriminatory planning to ongoing economic disinvestment and segregation and redlining and racial zoning, are inextricably linked to these infrastructural processes in terms of the inventory, condition, distribution of physical infrastructure systems, and even the maintenance and rehabilitation decisions and processes that we make in terms of investments through capital improvement programs. However, most often, folks who have been involved in the space of infrastructure management and a built environment haven't necessarily made this connection between these social and infrastructural processes. Next slide, please. But I want to offer sort of two frameworks that I work within between environmental justice and social vulnerability to disaster that offers us perspective by which we may sort of examine the connection between social processes and infrastructural processes. Environmental justice talks about how the nation's environmental laws, regulations, policies have not been fairly applied across all segments of the population. When it comes to social vulnerability to disaster, social stratification based on race, income, disability, gender, age, nationality, among other social characteristics, contribute to differential risk and impacts from disasters. And I also want to pause here parenthetically to say, to be clear, that although most often when we map and model issues around vulnerability and environmental justice, we reduce it to, race, income, and class labels. But these are fundamentally issues of racism, classism, sexism. And I want to be very clear about that. Next slide. And so some selected mentions from the environmental justice and social vulnerability literatures. Dr. Robert Bullitt in 1994 charged the nation to redefine environment to include infrastructure. My colleague, Dr. Sakobi Wilson here at the University of Maryland in 2008 talked about the failure of municipalities to install up-to-code sewer and water infrastructure can lead to vulnerabilities in sewer and water systems, particularly among poor people and people of color. Dr. Shannon Van Zandt in 2012 started to allude to how infrastructure and other environmental features can potentially modify vulnerabilities and exacerbate risk. And some of my early work in participatory planning, I discussed how through participation and community science provision of infrastructure, there's an opportunity for us to redistribute public resources towards justice and sustainability. Next slide, please. And so through my Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab at the University of Maryland, me and my research team do just that. We talk about the nexus of environmental planning, infrastructure planning, participation, and hazard mitigation and disaster recovery planning to think about the effects of infrastructure on a natural, built, and social environment. We also explore the role of infrastructure in modifying hazard and climate-related risk and even public health outcomes. We think about infrastructure design and resilience and adaptation and how we might change the way that we do business, both from a social management perspective as well as a physical design perspective in light of sustainability. I also talk a lot about, how can we mobilize and activate community and citizen groups to be involved in overseeing and provisioning infrastructure. And last and certainly not least, the foundation of my research program and the work out of my lab is to understand and address equity and environmental justice issues related to infrastructure and public works, particularly in terms of processes, distribution, and restorative justice. Next slide, please. And so just to take you all really quickly through some empirical work that I've done, across the country between Houston and Washington, D.C., I've been able to show that, particularly when it comes to stormwater infrastructure systems, that communities of color and lower incomes income communities in Houston have stormwater systems that are past their prime and outdated by development codes and just frankly not desirable by the community. And also the burden of maintaining some of these stormwater systems that are disproportionately located in communities of color falls on the community themselves as opposed to the city of Houston taking responsibility. And above and beyond sort of the neighborhood level factors that we might assume drive the distribution of physical systems, the percent non-Hispanic Black above and beyond was the most significant predictor of the distribution of these outdated systems. Next slide. Some of my other work in terms of mobilizing community students, their parents and teachers on the east end of inner city Houston, I developed a participatory assessment technique for infrastructure to be able to think about how can we engage community members for taking ownership over these systems and working with cities in order to effectively manage these systems. But most often, I know not only are these communities overburdened by environmental bads and locally unwanted land uses, but they also struggle with the burden of proof in terms of being able to, empirically demonstrate, in fact, that they're experiencing these things. And so immediately after I developed this participatory assessment technique, I took it a step further and developed an experiment alongside some of my engineering colleagues at Texas A&M to where we sort of we set up an experiment by which community scientists, trained engineers, and LiDAR technology inspected the same set of infrastructure assets, and we were able to empirically show that there wasn't a statistically significant difference in the quality of data between citizen scientists, trained inspectors, and LiDAR technology in terms of validity and reliability. Next slide, please. And lastly, one of my more recent publications really just shows how, we have to sort of envision a future by which, municipalities, universities partner with communities to design grassroots master plans that include infrastructure interventions that address a number of issues from sustainability to climate change and flood risk. And these sort of grassroots master plans is just sort of the first step of leveling the landscape for these communities who have been marginalized over time. Next slide, please. And so, the main takeaways for my presentation is really sort of charging you all to think about equity and infrastructure in terms of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. And also thinking about sort of the built environment or in terms of stormwater or public health infrastructure must be recognized as a continuation of social circumstances in terms of these larger social processes that moderate outcomes related to infrastructure. And lastly, the future is hopefully more democratic and democracy is alive and well. And the more folks that we have participating in processes related to infrastructure and beyond is critical through community science and civic participation and different types of partnerships that are fundamental to equity and resilience. Next slide, please. And I always just like to end on this slide. This picture is a picture of me and a group of Black and brown students on the east end of inner city Houston, who I dedicated my dissertation research to, and I really believe that they're the vanguard of the environmental justice movement moving forward. And I owe sort of all of my early work and my entire career to them in terms of really sharing with me their knowledge and intuition around a number of these critical issues. Thank you all so much.